authors have nothing without readers, and I don't take that for granted. I write, as we'll probably discuss, very underrepresented topics that readers might not, naturally gravitate to. And so for an opportunity like this and to chat with you, and it's just, it's really great. So thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Deckled Edges. I'm your host, Camilla, and today I have for you a very, very special episode. We not only have our first interview episode on the podcast, but I have with me a very special guest, best-selling and award-winning historical fiction author, RUTA SEPETYS, author of novels such as Between Shades of Grey, which was adapted into a movie in 2019, super exciting, Salt to the Sea, I Must Betray You, Fountains of Silence, many more, but also most recently, the Bletchley Riddle, which is a new book for middle grade readers. So that is super exciting. It's really an honor to have you here with me today, Ruta. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you for having me. It's just such a privilege to be here.
Well, why don't we start with you giving a little introduction about yourself and your journey as an author and your work?
Thank you. My journey to becoming a novelist was in no way traditional, I think. I wrote my first book when I was quite young in elementary school, and it was, let's say, a failed experiment. It was called The Adventures of Betsy. And let's just say that it met with some very negative reviews. And that experience, it stole my courage. I knew I wanted to write when I was 9 years old. But because of those bad reviews, I sort of changed gears and pursued different paths and pursued storytelling through music. And so for 22 years after college, I worked in the music business, helping songwriters and musicians and bands tell their stories through song. And it wasn't until one of those musicians turned the tables on me and said, "Hey, Ruta, what's your story?" that I really began writing in earnest, because my first answer, and I wonder for all of your listeners, if someone asks you, "What's your story?" How do you respond? The first thing out of my mouth was, "My story. I'm Lithuanian." And there was this really awkward silence. And the singer of the band said, okay, how long have you had that?" And I thought, no, Lithuanian's not an illness. Lithuania is a country. And we had this brief conversation about it. And he so wisely said, he said, "Ruta, with all due respect, not many of us understand what it means to be Lithuanian, what Lithuania as a country represents. I think you need to find a way to tell your own story." And that led me to writing my first novel, Between Shades of Grey. It was such a transformative moment, this fork in the road that I never saw coming.
Wow. That's so impactful. It's great to see like someone taking a chance on you and that can completely change your idea of having courage in yourself and really discovering what it is your story is to share. And I can totally
Yes,
relate to that.
because also, I think that as we're in school and in college, and there's a lot of roads that we can take. And what I didn't realize is that there's not only a lot of roads that we can take, but as we take roads, it takes many roads to reach a destination. And sometimes we get lost, we get turned around, the car breaks down, and then we get back on the road. And so I took many roads. I worked in video games. I worked on two Halo games and a bunch of Ratchet and Clank games, storytelling, but in a different medium. I worked in television, I worked in music. And so then all those roads now have led me here. And I'm so grateful for that. And do you know, I really believe some people ask, was that a waste of time, all those years that you spent in storytelling in another medium? No, it wasn't. It brought me here. And I think I'm a better writer because of it.
I think it's just so versatile, Like I think definitely having that background in those different mediums. I mean, video games, songwriting, those are all such like integral ways of conveying something that people kind of overlook. So I can definitely see how that maybe brought you towards historical fiction because historically, I not no pun intended, but it is an extremely complex and compelling genre that you really need that background in storytelling to do well. So I can imagine the depth of research and creativity that you need. So it's so inspiring to hear all of these different roads that you took that led you to this genre. Is there
Thank you.
any like insight that you've discovered while working in the specific niche of writing that you would share to the listeners?
Yes, and I'll start with the niche I discovered actually when I was still working with musicians and songwriters. I realized that when they put a piece of their own story into their work, their own passion, their own emotional truth, however it was represented, it made the work more successful. Those were the songs that became the anthems, that became hits, so to speak. And so I realized that that emotional truth has resonance. And so when I then transitioned to writing into novels, I quickly realized, wait a minute, it's so crucial. Yes, it's fiction, but let's go to the source. Let's go to the true witnesses and take elements of their emotional truth and put it into this fiction, and it makes it more authentic. So yeah, that's some of those things I learned that helped me with my niche of writing. And also, some people might realize that many of my books are, yes, they're historical, but they're not in the distant past. They're during time periods where we still have access to survivors, and that's because I want that true testimony.
Who would you say is the most impactful person you've met while researching for your novels? I mean, I can imagine that you were saying you do research these more recent events where we have access to survivors and testimonies and interviews. And actually, recently, one of my family friends and neighbors, we found out through conversation that he's Latvian, and we were chatting about your writing, and it came up that his father happened to be deported for 10 years to one of the labor camps in Siberia. And it was just so impactful to see someone's hidden story that perhaps, they probably don't bring it up so often, but be shared as a result of one of your novels. So, and to be able to make that connection. So, I can imagine you've had so many of those experiences through research. So who would you say is your most impactful story that you've been able to uncover through that?
It hits really close to home. It's my parents. My parents were survivors, they were refugees, they were freedom fighters. And growing up with parents who had overcome so much and taught me so much about resilience and that we can't choose our hardships, but we can choose how we face our hardships. That began absolutely everything. Everything started there. Both of my parents experienced very difficult childhoods. My father fled from Lithuania when he was a small boy because his father was on the execution list. He was a high-ranking military officer, and they fled. They spent 9 years in refugee camps before being able to come to the United States. My mother was the youngest of 11 children. Her father died before her second birthday, and his death plunged the family into poverty, into extreme, extreme poverty. And how my parents both became, these fighting spirits and successful human beings and successful parents. That really was the start. I believe now, looking back and reflecting on it all, they were the biggest inspirations.
Wow. I can, sometimes it's the people that are closest to home that really have that great impact on you. I know I definitely feel the same way about, my parents, my grandparents. You really feel that influence and what they went through and their stories so often so captivating that it makes you feel like it motivates you to kind of share that with the world. So thank you for sharing that. Wow.
Thank you. And I have so much admiration for you that at such a young age, you do have a reverence and an appreciation for your family. I don't know, to be honest, if I did. It was kind of difficult growing up with this name. that Americans pronounce RUTA SEPETYS. But it's difficult to say my name in English. It's RUTA SEPETYS, and you pronounced it so beautifully at the beginning. Thank you. But I go by RUTA SEPETYS. When people would see my name, still to this day, they say, "What are you?" And I say, "Oh, well, I'm Lithuanian." And then the conversation kind of ends, and I have to pick it up and take the ball and run with it. But when I was younger, I didn't necessarily have that awareness or reverence of, no, wait a minute, this means something. This means that, my family, they pursued strength through struggle and hope through hardship. And I'm so grateful that you have that awareness with your family around you.
Thank you. I think, you know, it's more so like through reading and through really kind of, well, not really getting to know authors, but through your work, I feel like you convey a part of that definitely through, especially through your novels who have so much kind of influence. You can really tell that you're imbuing your own experiences into these characters and into making them seem very human. I know when I was reading, especially your first novel, Between Shades of Grey, Lena and the struggles that she faced, they felt very real. I mean, I don't know if it was because I kind of resonated as a younger girl and kind of seeing how she had to go through all of these like pivotal moments in her life, so young too. It was very impactful. So I guess my next question to you would be, how what aspect of humanity do you most try to pinpoint and capture through your work? I definitely think it would be similar to your previous responses, but I can imagine, having to imagine a character who isn't exactly in your position, doesn't come from the same background as you, but making their struggles feel human. How do you convey that?
Oh, well, I convey that by trying to make the characters dimensional, dimensional human beings. We have strengths, but we also have a lot of weaknesses. We have fears, we have hopes and dreams. And that's what makes us human and dimensional instead of just feeling sort of flat. And so I try to imbue that way by even rhythms. When I'm meeting with the true witnesses, I'm not only in my field journal, in my notes, making, taking down notes of where they're getting emotional and what they're describing, but also how they're moving and their expressions. And I feel that, history, there's so much detail in history. But I have a theory that feelings stay with us longer than facts. And if I can express those feelings, then that is something that will help me convey what I'm writing about.
Wow, that was that was such a great response because
Thank you.
as someone who I haven't really had much writing background, but I enjoy writing, but I definitely feel like that feeling aspect is what you can always really tell when an author cares and when an author is well versed and like was really involved in writing. I think you can always tell the difference between a drier text and someone who really steeped their writing, not just in fact upon fact, but really human emotion. And I think I really get that through your writing. And so it's so inspiring to see you talking about it like this. Um,
Well, I want to also just comment that's not just me. That is you, all of your listeners. So often, we think that writing well is about the kind of instruction we've had, or where we've traveled, or these accolades, or what we've experienced. But I'm going to argue that, and I'm going to say that writing well is more about being able to express what is in our heart and is in our head. And so I'll tell your listeners that if you have felt deeply, if you felt something deeply, as we all have, that means you've lived deeply, and you have the tools to be a writer in some way, a storyteller in some way. There are lots of ways to tell a story. And I know writing seems like it could be this elusive thing that, the muse has to beckon and you have to work with this muse. But I contend that any and all of us if we are honest about what we're feeling, and try to express it as best we can, even if that's raw and sloppy and ugly and painful, that's going to connect with the reader.
And I think it definitely does. I mean, in practice, it is certainly working very well. So, yeah, I that's such great advice because I know a lot of people who are aspiring writers and who really want to be able to learn how to tell a story. And I think, this idea that it's within us all. And I know one of your books is actually on that same topic, but it's more of a kind of guide to that. But
Yeah.
it's just so great to kind of get that advice out there. And yeah, I it really resonates. I think being able to kind of look inwards within yourself.
And it's not always easy because I'm writing about history and memory is a slippery slope, right? Some of us are desperate to remember and others are desperate to forget. And we have to respect all aspects of that. When I meet someone, and this is something I learned when writing Between Shades of Grey, I had no experience interviewing people, let alone true witnesses and survivors and family members of victims, that in putting together the questions to elicit the best of memory, we don't interrogate people and don't ask answers that are sort of yes and no questions, which obviously as a host. You don't do that. And what I do when I'm speaking with people to really get those responses that are rich, I try to ask sense memory questions. So, for example, with Between Shades of Grey, which takes place in a death camp in Siberia, and not just Siberia, in the Arctic at the North Pole. And when I sat down with people, instead of just asking, was it cold? How did you feel? Were you angry? Things like this, I said, it's the middle of the night. There's a knock on the door and you're arrested. You're an innocent human being. Take me there. And that kind of take me there, the the people that I was interviewing, they remembered and recalled things. Again, this memory, you open a door and it opens a window and you keep going through these portals. And then they were sharing all of a sudden what it sounded like, what it hurt, what it smelled like, what the feeling on their skin was. And all of that helps again with those dimensional details that I mentioned.
Yeah. I think, yeah, the best way to write humans is to go right to the source, right? And to be around humans. And I think a lot of people, maybe, especially people who are kind of new to meeting with strangers and kind of interacting in that way, don't understand that when you're trying to capture humanity, you need to really relate to the experiences and not just the cold questions that I think a lot of people think about, especially kind of aspiring journalists, storytellers, all that kind of thing. So it's really so interesting to hear that. Um, Unfortunately, I can't ask you too many sensory questions, but maybe, and
Yeah.
definitely in the future about when talking to people who have gone through things like that.
Yeah.
Um, in that same vein, maybe could you walk us through what your researching process looks like and as
Mhm.
well and how that ties into your writing process in addition to
Yeah.
your course?
Yes, of course. And I will say that they're very intertwined, my research and writing. But before I begin, my very first step is identifying what has come before me. That can be history texts, that can be um, primary sources, again, testimony, oral histories, things like this, memoirs. Sometimes I even, depending on the subject I'm writing about, I have access to journals and private diaries. And reading all of that first helps give me a footing that I think is very necessary, because my next step is pretty aggressive. I'm going to travel to the place where this happened, where the events occurred, boots on the ground, and I'm going to sit with those true witnesses. And before I do that, it's essential that I have a working knowledge of the history that I'm writing about because it would be really disrespectful for me to expect these people I'm meeting with to educate me and inform me. No, they lived this. So I need to have a working knowledge of that. So reading, and that's why I have to work on multiple projects at once, because if I just worked on one project at once, Camilla, it would take me 10 to 12 years to write a book. So I'm reading, then I travel and I connect with true witnesses. And depending on the project, my publishers in different countries can help connect me with people. Unlike other authors who can't post on social media about what they're working on, I do because it leads me to sources. And then I sit with the people. And after each interview, I build in an hour after each interview. First of all, for an emotional decompression, because some of the things we're talking about are very heavy, very emotional, not only for the person, but for me. I want to respect that. I want to be present with them. And to be present means you're also in that emotional moment. So then I carve out time afterward to take down my impressions. And so when I say the researching and writing is integrated, I will, in that hour after the interview, I often sketch dialogue and scenes. And after I will never forget this, even though this was like in 2005 and 6 that I was researching for Between Shades of Grey. I met with this incredible survivor, Irena Spakowskiana, who very much elements of her story infused and inspired this character of Lena Vilkas, the main character in Between Shades of Grey. And as she was talking to me, I was taking notes and noting where I was becoming emotional. And again, this was my debut novel, so I really didn't have a system down yet. But what I realized and what I was marking when I was taking notes was where I had what I call a heart hop, where I became emotional. And then in that hour afterward, I am transcribing that. How could I express this and 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 really infuse it into the text, because I fear that if I research and then a year later go to write the book, I'm going to lose that sense of emotional immediacy. So Irena, for example, she was telling me, she said, Ruta, I was a 15-year-old girl. It was the dark of night. I was getting ready for bed when they came to arrest us, and and then we were arrested and sent us into these cattle cars. And she mentioned that, you know, she said, they took me in my nightgown. This was so disrespectful. It made no sense. And they took me in my nightgown became the very opening line of Between Shades of Grey. And it's a way that when I do the research in this immersive manner, I'm not only sharing a story, but I am sharing the testimony of Irena. So, for example, when she opened the book and the first line is, they took me in my nightgown. Hopefully, she sees, oh my gosh, Ruta, she heard me, she saw me. Like, even though the character is Lena and there's different elements. So, all of that research comes together. And then the people that I work with, if they are willing and able, if they speak and read English, um, to be research partners, then they read the drafts alongside of me with the Fountains of Silence and I Must Betray You, even with Salt to the Sea. The research partners, they were reading drafts beside me. So it's a lovely process of collaboration, which I did use in the music business. And I understand that writing for many can seem like a very solitary endeavor, but it doesn't have to be. And for me, it's really a team sport. There's so many people working, and the research is a team sport, and I research and write at the same time. I apologize for the long answer, but I hope you can tell I'm so passionate about this.
No, I mean, the more you talk, the better. This is great, to be honest. But yeah, it really is so collaborative, and I love hearing that because, you know, a lot of times you kind of, especially when you're younger, I feel like I'm kind of experiencing that right now, where sometimes you can feel very solitary in kind of trying to figure out the path forward is and what the journey is. But people skills are so important because life is collaboration, we have empathy. And what you were saying, you were able to, you wanted to document desperately in those interviews, those heart hops, those really like those times where you were able to tangibly feel that empathy. And that really speaks to me because life is collaboration, life is humans connecting with humans. It's why we have empathy. So that was really interesting to hear about in the process. And I loved hearing about that. So thank you so much. um, I would say because you were talking about Between Shades of Grey and you were talking about this wonderful testimony um that you received and how you incorporate that. But it was your debut novel and you were saying you didn't really have a pattern yet. How do you feel your writing has evolved since then? Like what new pathways are you going down as a more established author, would you say?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you, because it does evolve and it does change. And I will say that I imagined that once I published my first book, it would actually become easier, right? You know what you now, what you didn't know before. But honestly, it hasn't because I think I feel more of a sense of responsibility. And now that I have, and I forgive me if this sounds precious, but to say that I have a readership and I know I have readers who will come to my books, I don't want to let them down. And I think very deeply when I first wrote Between Shades of Grey, I really wanted to capture the history and the story, which of course is my first goal always. And in my research, I often come upon so many things that would make, ooh, this is going to make a really salacious story. This is a juicy detail. But that might serve the story, but it doesn't serve the history. I need to serve the history, but in the same breath, I want to serve the readers to sometimes to provide an understanding that's easy to grasp, that's compelling, that will keep them turning the pages. As you can imagine, if I spend 5 to 7 years just researching a book, there's so much detail that's in my head that my first drafts are complete info dumps. And now when I go back, knowing and having feedback from readers, which is so important. And I understand that that's something that is particular to me. I have friends who are authors who say, no, don't worry about the reader, don't think about the reader. But I do because I get so much thoughtful and introspective feedback from the reader. So now I'm not only balancing the research but I'm thinking about the reader. I'm thinking about those witnesses and their testimonies. So now the weave that I'm doing and the braiding that I'm doing, I think now is much more complex than what it was when I just set out in the beginning and said, I just want to tell this story. But that's okay because there are readers who tell me, "Oh, your writing is the same. I could find a book on the street, and if it didn't have the cover, I would know it's your writing." And I wouldn't say that's my writing style. It might be my lack of style, if you will. Short sentences, short chapters, an economy of phrasing. How can I express something in fewer words? So all of that goes into play. And let's also talk about publisher expectations because there is a business to writing because I am what's known as traditionally published. And when I began, self-publishing really at that point wasn't a viable option, but now it's not only viable, it's a fantastic option. You can self-publish, but I'm traditionally published, which means I have a publishing house who publishes my work. I have an agent. I have a team of publicists and marketing reps and brand managers and all of these people. And when I wrote Between Shades of Grey, I didn't have any of that. I didn't have a brand, right? I just had, my heart. And fortunately, though, the people that I've worked with have said, that's okay, Ruta. We'll build a brand around your heart and what you're trying to do. So there's just a lot more cooks in the kitchen now. But again, because I'm a collaborator and I believe it's a team sport, I really couldn't see it any other way. But one of the other things that is quite different is when I was writing my debut novel, I knew that I wanted to write for young readers because I remember the impact that stories had on me as a young reader, tremendous impact. And so I knew I wanted to write for young readers. What happened is that, yes, young readers found my books, but then they shared them with teachers, parents, grandparents. And so now I have what's known as a crossover audience. So what's different now also is that my publisher is saying, great, you're going to write about this topic and make sure that you deliver a book that's enjoyed from readers who are in sixth grade up to people who are in their 80s. Camilla, think about that. Like, really? You're going to be 12 or 85 and the book has to appeal to everybody. That's kind of a challenge there. So I didn't have that in the beginning and now I have that. And I feel very fortunate that I do have that. But
Yeah, it's totally a different level of expectation. I could totally imagine.
you
Um,
summed it up. I should have just said that. I should have
no,
said,
that's
what's the difference? It's a different level of expectation. Yes, you're brilliant. Exactly.
but it's definitely I think there's a merit to both fields, you know, because when you are starting out, you have these people around you, but you're also kind of almost more alone in a sense because you don't have that kind of push and pull of the feedback of the audience. But I guess since you're in the business of telling stories, like you were saying, like you have this responsibility to tell this compelling story, but you also have more people. And I guess when you're trying to be a story or when you are a storyteller, sorry, when you are a storyteller, the more stories, the more input that you have available to you, the better. So I think that's really lovely that, you know, obviously I think there is the pitfall of having that expectation on you. But at the same time, you've just been able to handle it with such grace and imbue it with such, you know, with
Thank
such
you.
emotion.
Thank you. No, and when you said trying to be a storyteller. No, wait, you are a storyteller. No, I am still trying to be a storyteller. And I love that aspect of it because, oh my goodness, please, stop me if I ever say, well, I'm a storyteller. There is so much to learn, and I still have so much growth potential. It doesn't matter if you're a New York Times bestseller or whatever those titles on your books say. There's always room to grow, and that excites me, right? That I'm still trying to be a storyteller to the point where if I'm on an airplane and someone, we're sitting on the runway and someone's like, "Oh, what do you do?" I have this moment where I say, um, well, I'm a writer. And they're like, "Oh, what do you write?" Books. And I realize that I'm struggling to express what I do because I'm still trying to be a storyteller, to your point.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think it's this great intersection of self-definition, but also really there's something so great about being in, I think, in writing, but it also applies to many things. I think even surgery, even teaching, all of these different things that, you know, you're always learning. And that's the beauty. I think that's the most, to me, that's my favorite kind of job to speak to people about because when you're in this always learning growth mindset, it just sets the stage for such incredible things to happen. And I think that's definitely what's happening with you. Every novel, you can definitely, I just feel this intense empathy that runs through it and just your desire to grow and to always be learning about these about people and stories. That's so resonant, you know, it's very resonant.
Oh, thank you. And honestly, my desire is really is twofold. So I want people to discover these underrepresented parts of history. And then through reading my books, let's remember they're fiction. I want readers then to be inspired to say, wait a minute, let me go look this up myself. Let me Google this. Let me research this. And one of the things that we're coming to now that I have put out, I have 8 books or seven or 8 books, 7 I think that are published and one's on the way. This challenge of okay, I'm a young adult author, and my publisher and agent are hoping to expand my readership. How do they do that? And there are some strategies now that are coming into play that are like, well, wait a minute. If one of my books is in the adult section of the bookstore, let's say I publish something for adults and something that might be, I call them heavy historicals. Like my heavy historicals, they're for the young people, right? They're for the young readers, the students but if I publish something that's a bit lighter for adults, could that lead them to this bit of hidden history? So also it's a challenge managing, the business expectation and industry and publisher. Your publisher always wants to help you grow. So whereas when I think of growth, I'm thinking of myself, how can I grow as a writer, as a more compassionate human, to deepen my understanding of the human experience and express it in books for young people. The publisher's thinking, how can we find a bigger audience for you and then bring them to these heavy historicals? Yeah.
I think that's something that people don't consider as well, that the business aspect must be woven into these like emotional considerations. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it falls more into a gray area, but be it as it may, there are these it is a consideration that you have to take into account. But I think that that's something I noticed when you say as if you've kind of grown into it as you get a bigger audience, but even in your first book, In Between Shades of Grey, I keep bringing it up because it was the first one I read, but I
Yes.
remember I told my dad. Well, my dad had heard about it because we were familiar with you,
Right.
but after reading it, I told him, I think you would really enjoy this. And my dad, I think I'm more of the reader of the family, but my dad is known to pick up a book or two, but he hadn't in a while. But all of a sudden, he reads this book and he tells me, Camilla, and he's 58 and I'm 17. And there's a big, like, almost mindset discrepancy there because you have a avid reader,
Yes.
but you also have an adult male who isn't too familiar with books, and all of a sudden he's telling me, wow, this is really interesting and this is so wonderful. And then I just see and all of a sudden we get an order for all of your books, and he's reading, he's flying through them as fast as I am. And it's just so wonderful. And I think you and your publishers have definitely accomplished your goal of reaching this audience, because it is impactful, no matter how concise or certain phrasing may be. It's not necessarily what I would say a dense novel, but the stories are so poignant that it is, from a reader perspective, they are very, very just effusive and they're relatable to so many people. So
It's
thank
what
you.
we need to do. We need to make the history human. We need to, to share our stories. I'm such a big believer that knowledge of story facilitates human understanding. When we understand the story of our neighbors, of people in our family, it helps us relate to them better. And as you said previously, allows us to use our gifts of empathy and compassion to look through someone else's eyes and consider their hearts, and how powerful that can be when that is a multi-generational thing. In the Czech Republic, I'm very fortunate to be published in 60 countries, and that is not my achievement. That's the achievement of my translators and my publishers. They're heroes. Um, but in the Czech Republic, when I went there, all of the messaging and everything was, this is the family author. And I didn't quite understand. And I said, what does that mean that I'm a family author? In the United States, I'm an author of historical fiction. And they said, Ruta, here in the Czech Republic, you're an author that kids, parents, and grandparents, they all read. It's this intergenerational read. And this is not something that was by design or a brand strategy. Goodness, no. But to hear that that's exactly what happened with your own father, it means so much to me because I don't know, it allows us to connect in new and different ways. And your father has a different perspective, a different experience than you do. You read the same book, and again, this is the beauty of book clubs and shared reads, and especially what I found, sometimes my books are chosen as, let's say, an all community read. So readers in a community or a city, an all city read, they read the same book. And when I do those events, it is so powerful because we have readers not only from different generations, but maybe whose families stood on opposite sides during the wars and during the conflicts that I'm describing. Yet here we are, all in the auditorium together. And I stand on stage and I literally get chills because I think history divided us, but through reading, we can be united in story and study and remembrance. And how much more powerful is that when we're doing that with people of all ages and all perspectives? And so it's just such a gift and such an unexpected gift. When I was working in the music business, bailing rock stars out of jail, if someone would have said to me, fast forward, RUTA SEPETYS, and you're not going to be doing this. You're going to be helping, yes, share stories, but in your own words and from your own heart. I don't think I would have believed them. I really don't. Yeah.
It's funny how that works. There's
Yeah.
such a lattice of overlapping and completely different perspectives. And sometimes all you need is a conduit. And I'm so glad that you're able to have this experience as an author. It must be so incredible to be able to be that conduit for people, to be that unifying factor for these different stories and perspectives. I love storytelling, and having read all my life, this is why I kind of decided to create this podcast, because I want to share my thoughts, but I also want to hear other people's thoughts, and I want to share the perspective of you as well, like the authors who I'm talking about, and they'll have a completely different. You'll be able to provide such unique insight, and that's so valuable, especially to someone like me who I'm starstruck, and I'm just
Mhm.
so happy that you're able to really empathize and have be so welcoming and open. And I really resonate with that. Thank you so much.
But we're in this together, right? Reading really is a creative partnership. An author provides words and text, and as the reader creates the characters in their head and heart. The reader's the one who's controlling the faders on the emotional meters and amplifying everything. So it really truly, unlike a movie where they show us the character, they show us the setting. In a TV show, they play music to kind of amplify the emotion. In a book, it's up to the author and the reader. And then what you're doing is you are taking that creative partnership and giving voice to that through this podcast. It's and I do have to say, Deckled Edges, it's so fitting because do you know the very first edition of Between Shades of Grey that they published? It has deckled edges. It means so much to me. It's so cool that that's what your podcast is called.
That is so cool. I chose it, and my audience is like it's mostly people from my school, and varying levels of readers. So I wasn't sure how much it would people how many people would understand that. But wow, that's awesome. I'm a fan, as you can tell. I'm a very big fan of the
And think about it. Why are we fans of deckled edges? Because, you know, they're imperfect. They're a bit rough, right? They're more raw. And I think it really represents everything about the human experience that really, we're perfect in our imperfection, and something can be beautiful when it is a bit raw, a bit, rough around the edges. I find that. So that's why I love deckled edges.
I would venture to say they have more character than the
Yes.
steel cut and lovely. But I mean,
Even though I do have to say now, because I've been on tour, I was in 18 states over October on tour for my latest book, The Bletchley Riddle. And when I was going into bookstores, I'm seeing these incredible spine designs where the not only the spine, I guess, but the pages are sprayed and they're cut, and there's now the end paper there, it's really gorgeous the way that they're designing books, but they're not deckled. It's very it's very intentional and it's very stylized, whereas I would think, to your point, that deckled edges have more character.
I think so too, but I also love when I love personally, I don't know how much of a role that the author plays in the cover and the jacket design, but I love when people have fun with their books because books, some people make the argument that they're becoming obsolete in favor of the ebook, and I wholeheartedly disagree. There's so much value to having a physical object, it is like in and of itself, it's an experience. You're opening the page for the first time. And I love when authors have fun with that. I love when just designers, it's this whole collaborative process to, create and like amplify that experience beyond just the words on the page. So I think that's so cool. Um,
Well, and it's so apropos of you to say that you don't know how much authors have you know, collaboration in that. Actually, we have minimal collaboration. We have consultation. Now, granted, if you're J.K. Rowling or you're Stephen King, you can probably collaborate on anything that you want. But for most of us, we have consultation. So the publishers work so hard. They have designers who are so brilliant. They have researchers and people who are in brand concept and looking at color, different color palettes and the psychology of color and what represents an emotion and things like that. And so they work very hard to come up with these really, really compelling designs. And then they show them to the author. And for Between Shades of Grey, the cover was done and they said, this is the cover. And fortunately, the hardcover of Between Shades of Grey, it's a very minimal design. It's this bloom coming out of the snow that represents the force of life and the power of love with barbed wire around the edges, amidst occupation, but they said, this is your cover. And fortunately, I loved it. But then as you go on, they will consult you. Now, overseas, the publishers often they like to create their own covers and also their own titles, which are very different. So, for example, Between Shades of Grey, in Germany, it's not called Between Shades of Grey, it's called The Invincible Summer Inside of Me. In Portugal, it's called The Long Winter. I'm thinking of some of these different titles. In Italy, where it's not published for students, they think it's very dark and a bit sad. It's only published for adults, and they gave it a very poetic title. It's called They Even Turned Off the Moon. They took everything from us, but they even turned off the moon. And so I have all of these different titles, all of these different covers. And again, same text, same history is inside the book. But again, this reader interpretation, which I just love and fascinates me, and different countries see different parts of history in their own unique way. For example, Spain, it's a story of patriotism. In France, Between Shades of Grey is a story of identity. And so these different interpretations are reflected on the cover. And I first learned that, I remember when I was in Lithuania in my father's home country and I saw a book and I said, "Oh, that looks like interesting. That looks like Harry Potter." And they said, "It is Harry Potter." And I said, "Really?" But it has a different cover and a different title. And they said, "Yeah." So I think that's fascinating, that interpretation.
I think that's something that I never really thought about because, when your book gets translated, there's languages have this interesting I love linguistics too. I think it's so fascinating because the way that you perceive the world is so influenced by language. And
Yeah.
when you were saying those titles, they're so poet almost all of them are just so poetic, but they capture the book in different ways. And I love knowing that these different national perspectives are impacted by, the values of the nation, the values of the readers, the culture. I think that's so beautiful. And it must be even better to be able to see that as an author because it's your writing, but you're seeing it almost take on a different, like put on a different cloak, And I think that's lovely. That's so cool.
I agree. I agree with you. I agree with you. And how lucky I am, Camilla, to have these publishing partners now in 60 countries who are helping me give voice to people who never had a chance to tell their story.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. I think, wow, that's such a cool anecdote, and it's something that you never get to hear, especially um. So that's such a valuable thing about being able to really connect with an author. That's so cool. Who would you say is, I know it must be hard to choose because they're so different, but
Yeah.
what would you say was your favorite character to ever write? And what made them stand out?
Oh, it's so difficult, but I will, and I know we've been talking a lot about Between Shades of Grey, but and I will say, and I hope this isn't a cop out, but I actually have a different favorite for every single novel. Um, one of my favorite characters to write is from my book Salt to the Sea, The Shoe Poet. The Shoe Poet, and this is also something we're going to get back to rhythmic characters, um, and the impact that my experience in the music business has on my writing. Working in music taught me the power of melody and rhythm. And, your listeners might not remember one thing we say, on this podcast, but they might hear a song that they haven't heard in 5 years and they can sing every word to that song. And that's because melody and rhythm are powerful. And one of my favorite characters to write was this character of the shoe poet, an elderly man amidst this evacuation who boards a ship that he believes is bound for freedom. But how do we protect all that we love from an enemy we can't see? And this character of the shoe poet has not only a deeper experience, a higher experience, but a higher self. He's been through so much and he sees and feels what's coming. And whether that was because of everybody I had interviewed and that one of my own family members had passage on this doomed ship, um, I loved writing that character. I loved writing the character of Kretsky from Between Shades of Grey, the Soviet guard who, um, this he was he imprisoned himself? Characters that ask questions of the reader. I love these kinds of characters. Rafa in Fountains of Silence, Puri, Purificación in Fountains of Silence, characters that ask questions of me as the writer when I'm writing them, and then of the reader. Oftentimes, I will say the main characters, Lena in Between Shades of Grey, Josie in Out of the Easy, Joanna, Florian in Salt to the Sea, and certainly Anna in Fountains and Christian Florescu in I Must Betray You. These are characters, these main characters, primary characters. I write those characters, I think, in reflecting on my work, as people that I wish I could be like. People say, "Oh, are you your main characters?" I wish. These these incredible they're built from humans that I met with who are courageous and compassionate and deep and complex and flawed and real and deckled, as we would say, these deckled characters that I wish that I could be like in terms of courage and fortitude. But I find that my favorite characters to write are the ones who really, even Alfred in my book, Salt to the Sea, who is this Nazi sailor, so conflicted, so complex. And I don't know, is that if I really look at myself, is writing a self-examination? Am I like what's really going on here? But that's why I like those characters because they make me think deeply, not only into the subject, into the writing, but also into myself.
I think that's so true. I think this complexity that you portray, and a lot of your characters, they embody the best of humanity in the worst conditions possible. And I think that the best of humanity, when I say that, I don't mean that they're perfect. They're not Mary Sue's by any means. I think that's the kind of the best thing about reading your books because these characters, they have facets because like you said, you built real people into them. They are real to the reader, to you. They're reflections of humans, of humanity, and you capture that so well. But I also think you know, being these portrayals of humans, being the best version of humanity includes that gray area. It includes just these mental conflicts, mental struggles that when you're faced with these situations that are often horrible, horrifying, like you said, they took her in her nightgown, but the way that they respond to them, the connections that they make, I think that's one of my favorite parts, the connections that your characters make with each other, because not only do we get to see these like amalgamations of humanity, but we also get to see how two different amalgamations of humanity get to interact with one another. And it just kind of adds this layer of humanity to your novels that I don't know if you're aware, but it really makes for a lovely, lovely and true portrayal. It feels real and it feels human. And
But that's the kind of connection that we're having right now. And that's why I know a lot of authors say, no, I don't want to do school visits anymore. I'm not going to go on the road and I'm not going to do events. But if we don't, are we missing out on this chance? You said something tonight that really, it just was, is this moment for me when you said the definition of self. And you've said so many things this evening that I'm reflecting on, that I'm thinking, wow, yes. And it's this exchange. That's why I say it's a creative partnership. We're working together. And I understand that, yes, some incredible art is created through solitude. And I'm a massive introvert. I recharge when I'm alone. I feel at my creative best when I'm really alone. I'm one of those people who could live for a month in silence, but the joy and the richness, the inspiration, the ideas, it really does. It comes from this exchange. And as you said, the gray, even this character of Kretzky, showing kindness amidst an atmosphere of cruelty. These juxtapositions, I think, are so crucial to the art of storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I mean broadly in photography, in music, in those are a song is a story. And you need these juxtapositions, these opposing forces in music, major and minor. In a painting, it's a color variation. And those juxtapositions which are, essential to the human experience, I think. That's what happens. And that's what you're doing on this podcast and why I'm so grateful that you invited me on.
I'm so grateful to have you. But yes, this yin and yang, it's this timeless concept that will never go out. It will never, I think it's inseparable from art. And like you were saying, like when you are attempting to convey a story, when you do convey a story, you weave. And that's something that you said earlier that really stuck with me. You're weaving together these contrasts, these juxtapositions, these highs and these lows. And I think that being such a central concept to life in general, not just humans, but we see the river. We see how, some fish will swim upstream, but the river will flow downstream. Like there's so many little observations in life that you begin to see a pattern. The best thing about humans, I believe, I think, is our pattern recognition. Like you said, we recognize rhythms, we recognize people, faces, we see faces where they're not faces, we see connection where there isn't connection. And I think to be able to capture that in art, like you were saying, paintings, music, but also writing, I think that's the truest form of being able to preserve life. So I love to see that, and I love to hear you talk about it so passionately.
Oh, thank you.
To have a almost a complex to say name. I have quite the long name, I would say, and having that be such like your name is such an important part of you, and sometimes having people seeing how different people pronounce it, even if it's incorrect or even if it's wrong, I think it's so interesting because it is your first impression of someone beyond their face. Like even before you meet them, sometimes you'll see someone's name and you'll make conclusions about them. And I just think that's so interesting how each part of us really affects our perception of others. So
And our name, I mean, that's our origin story. That might be one of our very earliest stories. Why we're named, what is the story behind our name? for everybody that there is a story. And even when people say, "Oh, there is no story," but then they tell me, "Oh, my mom named me after the nurse who helped deliver," but that's a story. There is a story, and that also plays into our identity, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is by Dostoevsky, and he said, "But for who could live and not have a story to tell?" And everyone does have a story. No matter, some people will come to me and say, "I'm really struggling writing my college essays. I don't know what to write about. I don't feel like I have, you know, a hook or a story." And you don't really need a hook because by living, you have an experience and you have a story. So I think that's something that you really value and I admire so much in you.
I do. I mean, this mantra of write what you know, right? There's this mantra in the publishing industry when it comes to well, to fiction and nonfiction, but write what you know. What if we challenge that and say, write what you feel? Sometimes what we know, you know, as I get older, you know what I know? There is so much that I don't know. It's this interesting thing. The more books I write, the more I research, the older I get, I realize there is so much more. There's so much that I need to know, and I'm less sure. But what I am sure of is that our sharing of stories and sharing our feelings helps us better relate to people, and it bridges the widths between us. And during a time, when we might feel division is very palpable between us, when we share our stories and share our feelings in an essay, all of a sudden the world becomes less lonely. And we might feel, I definitely felt this when writing my first book. And even my family said, "You're going to write about the Lithuanian experience. No one knows about that, and no one's going to be able to relate to it." People did. They found these common themes of resilience, of fortitude, of, I don't know, just like I said, finding that strength through struggle. But then what it did was, growing up, I felt so alone as a Lithuanian American. Do you know now on tour, when I mentioned these 18 states that I was in, do you know there were Lithuanians who came out to my events, Camilla, in every single state? Like, I began this journey thinking that I was going to, help others tell their story. And what it's ended up doing is that it's led me to my own story. These people who have come out, some of them, they don't know me, but they're Lithuanian, and we feel this connection. But then other people have come out and said, "Could you be the granddaughter of?" They've brought pictures to my events of my grandparents. There have been people who have come to my events who said, "I think I was in the refugee camp with your dad." They've shown me photographs. So there are these elusive connections, but if we don't share our story, we might never find those points of connection. And they're out there. So I hope everyone will consider, sharing their story and finding ways to communicate with others.
Yeah, that's the big takeaway, I think, from this conversation that, you know, there's such value to stories. And sometimes all you need is to shout into the void and it'll come back to you. I think that's a funny way of how the world works. So thank you so much for coming on this podcast. Thank you so much for sharing and having this conversation with me. It was truly one of the best conversations I've had in a long time. Thank you so much, Miss Sepetys. Thank you so much.
I feel the same. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of your listeners, and however people are finding books. Whether it's historical fiction or fantasy or nonfiction or romance or poetry or just reading. Boy, I mean, reading joins us together, as a human community. So pick up a book, read something.
There you have it, folks. Please read something. Join us in our adventure to gain new perspectives, more empathy, and to feel more human together. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And thank you so much again, Ms. Sepetys, for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Have a lovely
bye.
night.
Bye.